It's Waponi-Woo time! Welcome to part 4 of my Orange Crush UI tutorial. This is Tom Auger, www.tomauger.com, doing a little supplement for a course or a substitute teaching that I was doing at Centennial College in Toronto. Shout out to all my peeps there that might be checking this video series out to help them get their assignments done on time. Anyway, let's continue with our analysis, a deep dive into how this progress bar was built. We're looking at the progress bar container, and in the previous rather long-winded episode, I spent most of the time on the drop shadow. Let's see if we can make better progress here. It's going to be a lengthy one. So we looked at the outer glow. So the drop shadow we saw was used to create a kind of a quasi-bevel effect, an inner bevel effect, and then the outer glow was used as the sort of the enabler for that. And we're using the outer glow, in fact, to create a stroke. I'm going to cancel out of here and unhide. Switch to the arrow tool so you can see the actual shape. There, highlighted now is the original vector path, and so you can see that the outer glow is being used. The shape itself is black as well, but the outer glow is being used to push that out beyond its boundaries by 7 pixels. And then the drop shadow, which is actually a drop highlight of sorts, because it's a white shadow, is poking out in the bottom right hand side of this element to create what appears to be a highlight. So to create that, to use outer glow as a stroke, I'm just going to hide the vector path again with Control H on the PC, Command H on the Mac. The outer glow has been set to multiply. The default is screen because outer glows tend to lighten things up, hence the name. If we forget what the name is and just think of it as an effect that allows me to create a gradient on the outside of any given shape. That's exactly what outer glow is good for, but I chose to use black as my color instead of white, so there it is. And as a result, I needed to change my blend mode either to normal or multiply. And like I said in the drop shadow discussion, we could use normal here and there wouldn't be any difference actually. The spread is being used to expand it out to its edges. You'll notice that I didn't put 100% spread there. 100% gave me very harsh edges, aliased edges. And so to keep it a little bit softened, I've used a smaller percentage for the spread. The size is exactly the amount of pixels out from the edge of the original shape that it's going to get pushed. Unlike the drop shadow, there is no offset, so it's going to be pushed equally on all sides of the shape. That's really all we had to do in order to move that outer glow and turn it into a stroke. So if you've already used up your stroke and you've used up your drop shadow and you still want to get a stroke effect on something, consider your outer glow with a spread of up to 100%. Sometimes you can go with just a slightly bit less than 100%. To achieve a spreading of a particular color out to the edges. All right, let's move on up the list. So the next thing that we added was the pattern overlay. So the pattern overlay starts off at the edges of the object. Once again, there's the vector shape itself, so you can see that the pattern overlay starts at the edges of the shape and just simply applies itself in a repeating pattern. This is the actual pattern that I designed. You can obviously choose this and pull down any pattern that you like from your list. The list is so long that we can't actually see the pattern that was selected here, sadly. YouTube HD restrictions on my massive monitor. Okay, so the one thing that you do get to control here is the scale. The default scale, of course, starts off at 100%, so that's the actual size of the shape that I ended up going with. And I wanted to keep that number to a nice round numbers, so 25%, 20%. Try to keep it to numbers that are going to divide nicely so you can get some clean edges. If I set this to 27%, it could get kind of fuzzy or pixelated, or it could see irregularities in there. So let's try to keep it to easily divided numbers. 25%, is exactly divided by 4. So you'll generally find less artifacting if you do that than with odd numbers. All right. That's pretty much all we have to do with pattern overlay. This one, really, there's no subtlety here. In this particular case, we're using pattern overlay just verbatim. So most of the effect that I had to do, you can see there's a bit of a highlight here. That was all done in the creation of the pattern itself. I will have a separate tutorial at some point on how to create seamlessly tiling patterns, because there's a couple of tricks to that. In this case, it's neither here nor there. Moving along then, the gradient overlay is a pretty simple thing. I highly recommend that, even if you're doing very simple buttons, that you look at applying a gradient overlay. One of the really neat things, and actually the latest update, if you're a Creative Cloud member, there was an update that was pushed about 3 months ago. It's now March 2013. For those of you in the future that are listening to this video, a few months ago, Photoshop 13 point, I don't know what, 1 or something. It was only available to Creative Cloud members at the time, and it allows you to actually export CSS for all of your layer effects, which is really cool. I haven't tried it yet. You can do overlays and gradients in CSS as well. So for those of you that are doing web buttons and web icons, really consider leveraging the overlays, because it adds a layer, a nice dimension of depth to any button. The important thing is, what turns most people off when they hit gradient overlay is that it puts this gradient over top of their whatever they got in their layer, and it totally destroys the layer because it's opaque and it sits over top of the layer pixels itself. The key here is to playing with the blend mode. So first thing I would do if I were you, if you were playing with this, is change this to either overlay, to anything in the middle here, overlay, or try hard light. Hard light's probably your best default go-to blend mode for gradient overlay if you're going to stick with the default gradient, which is black to white, because what hard light does is it takes any pixel color that's darker than 128, in other words darker than 50% gray, and uses it to darken the image or the layer below it, and any pixel value that's brighter than 50% gray, and we'll use it to lighten the image below it. So you can actually use, when you're using hard light, you can use your gradient to both lighten and darken the image below it without actually obliterating the pixels altogether. The normal blend mode, that's the default for your gradient overlay, is going to automatically destroy the layer beneath it. So again, if you want, open up a layer, apply this right now, and change your blend mode to hard light or overlay, and hit make default. And you'll find that every time you come here now, you'll see something a little bit more inspiring than this just as boring black to white gradient, which you probably thought to yourself, why would I ever want to do that? This just enhances what's already there. Overlay is a really cool one because it adds a bit of saturation and it messes with the color table a little bit. So you get sometimes some unpredictable results, but usually they end up looking pretty juicy. So I'd recommend applying that at all times. All right, the next one up, it was Inner Glow. Now here I'm starting to get now into trying to create the glass effect. We've worked with the background, we've worked with the elements in the bottom. Now we're starting to move up visually. As we're moving up the layer effect stack, don't forget that that also maps to their stacking order visually. And so now we're moving up forward to the glass bubble that I want to put in front of the Mercury that sits inside our progress bar. So Inner Glow is really basically, I haven't done too much here. I've still kept the blend mode to its default, which is screen. I've taken the I don't even know if I've changed the opacity. I think the default opacity is probably 75 as well. All I've done is I've changed the color from its default yellow, which I find a little bit questionable to begin with, just straight up to white. That way we're not really going to mess with the color of whatever the Mercury is in there. Certainly, by all means, experiment with that. You can give it a cooler or warmer glow by changing it between yellow and cyan a little bit to your taste. But in this case, just want to keep it neutral, and away we go with white. Haven't even changed really the technique. There's a center and edge. Center sets the gradient from the center and builds its way out. Edge is exactly the opposite. I have given it a bit of a choke. This was a lot of tweaking because it's going to have to synergize with inner shadow. You'll see in a minute. There was really a lot of tweaking between the size parameter and the choke. So the choke is just like we looked at with the drop shadow. Choke is going to take that gradient and push it outward toward the edges of the gradient, reducing the gradient to a thinner and thinner thing and pushing out the solid color that you've selected here as far out, just based on its opacity, as far out as you've chosen here. So this 20% is a percentage of the size. If the size is 0, choke doesn't matter at all. If your size is 10 and you've chosen a choke of 20%, that means you're going to be choking 2 pixels out. Pretty basic math that even somebody like myself can actually accomplish at 10:47 p.m. Wow, it's getting pretty late. All right. So that's what the inner glow's there for. It doesn't do too much without the inner shadow that I've thrown on top of it. Inner shadow, again, we're not going to see too much with the inner shadow until I add the stroke in. So let's just sort of add all 3 of these guys on and take them apart one at a time. I'm going to come back to the inner shadow. That's by far the more complex application, and just look at stroke. So if you recall, I'm using bevel and emboss over here to create that highlight glass highlight effect. Remember that you can use this for that. It's one of the few. There's about 3 effects that you can use to create a nice glass highlight. Actually, there's 4. You know what? There's probably more than that. Anyway, it's one of them, and this is the one that seemed to work. So it got used up for its 3D, and I still wanted to get a little 3D effect on this thing, make it look sunken in, so that's where I got into stroke. I gave it a size of 2 pixels, positioned outside from the edge of the shape. Kept the blend mode at normal. The real key is that I've changed the stroke from a color stroke to a gradient stroke. And that allows me now to, brings up the gradient picker, allows me to choose a gradient. And this time I just chose a simple linear gradient with a little bit of an angle. You're going to tweak this, you're going to play with that to get exactly the angle that you want. I'll pull this out of the way for a minute so we can see what's going on. And essentially what we want to do is we want to make sure that the darkest part of that gradient is concentrated in the upper left corner of the object, and the lightest part is in the bottom right hand corner. You'll use that to create a sunken in effect, or a deboss. To create an emboss, you just reverse that, which you can do by either reversing the angle or just hitting the reverse button. Where is it? There it is. There's the reverse button right there on the gradient, and now we get the exact opposite effect. You can see that. So I'm just going to play with that reverse button, in, and pulling it out. So highlight here, shadow there. That's going to make it look like this thing is popped out. Shadow here, highlight here, sunken in. So we're using the stroke to create a gradient, and then to create a little bit of a bump in that stroke, we're using inner shadow. Just going to apply the inner shadow there to darken up, just to give it a little bit more of an edge and add a bit more detail to this effect. This is what makes a great layer effect, is if you have a lot of detail in there, a lot of subtle things. Too many strong details and you end up with something that looks a little bit too harsh. But if you can add lots of little details, then you've got yourself a really powerful effect that's going to look good on a lot of different interface elements. So here we have, here's what we're doing with the inner shadow. We're not using it for a shadow per se, so we've set the distance to 0. In essence, the inner shadow and the inner glow are going to function very, very similarly. They're going to be a ring of color running around the edge of the shape, running around the contour of the shape and working its way inward. If we set the distance to 0, there's no offset whatsoever. Choke, same thing as we looked at before, to turn that from what usually is a gradient into more of a line. That's what we used in outer glow, for example, to turn that into the outer stroke. We're going to use that on inner shadow to create a bit of an inner stroke as well. But I wanted to keep that still a little bit softer to make it just feel a little bit more natural, part of the fall off of the beveled edge, so we kept the choke percentage lower in this case. And the size is just going to be the number of pixels that it takes to go from fully opaque to fully transparent. When we come back after the break, bevel and emboss.